Hello, and welcome to the channel of Praxia. My name is Vincent, and I am the founder of the Praxis Society. This video is the reference on this channel for basic information on the conception of Praxism. The purpose of this video is to provide an adequate definition for the term Praxism, and to simplify and portray the conception itself in a manner that aptly depicts its core tenets, so as to explicitly delineate this group's set of ideas and semantics, and outline both the source for our point of view, as well as that point of view itself, before diving into any other topic which may obscure what it is that we actually aim to espouse on this channel. By the end of this video, I wish to have done this in such a fashion that the listener is able to fully comprehend this idea, and even use it to sufficiently identify the proper aspects in other conceptions, according to the Praxis formula. This video will be separated into sections, which will hopefully cover all of the areas of general or particular interest, while still hopefully remaining as terse and as comprehensive as possible. The sections will proceed as follows. The first section will be Praxism as a conception considered in isolation. The second section will be Praxism as applied to the highest possible degree. The third section will be Praxism as applied to the humanly principle, and the fourth section will be ways in which Praxism may be identified within other conceptions. For a precursory introduction, however, the conception of Praxism is very simple in its own right, but when applied, it has the potential to be very complex. The pure idea, when considered in isolation, merely amounts to a formulaic conception that is universally applicable to all things. However, the complexity of these applications themselves has a wide range of variation. Therefore, the conception of Praxism, when applied to its fullest extent, may seem very foreign to the modern mind, which is not particularly used to considering a conception applied to such a scale, or any of that which such an application would entail. This, of course, requires the listener to expand one's frame of consideration, to incorporate realities and possibilities that were either never considered, or perhaps once rejected outright, for being so far outside the sphere of basic considerations necessary for a participation in contemporary discourse. I will also outline some basic terminology that we employ to refer to the individual tenets that are enveloped within the conception of Praxism as a whole, or to quickly and easily refer to things with a universal significance while avoiding the use of pre-established terms with pre-existing connotations. All of this being done, of course, with comprehensibility in mind. We will define these terms as they become relevant to the topics at hand. However, there are a few preliminary ones that are necessary to establish outright, which are integral to the entire theme of Praxism as a conception. The first of these terms is universality. We define universality as a state of being which is utterly unlimited, unrestricted, and unconditioned. That which is truly universal is in its applicable state, meaning that it is not in its applied state. It is universal insofar as it has not yet undergone any sort of refinement or formatting to any set of parameters whatsoever, and insofar as it does not possess any conditioning or distinguishing properties whatsoever. The universal is only discernible in its totality from the position of the universal itself, or if we were considering a more restricted universality, it is discernible from the position of a more universal logical necessity, but it is never discernible in its totality from the position of a non-universal or conditioned being. So, universality indicates or signifies the applicable and incorporative state, which is, once again, unlimited. The second term necessary to define is quintessentiality. We define quintessentiality as the most universal state of that which is still discernible as a conception. That which is quintessential possesses all of the qualities of universality, but is still particular in its conceptualization. It is quintessential because it is the pure essence of a particular thing, ontologically prior to the manifestation of that thing itself, and prior to any distinguishing properties except for that of concept or conceptualization. We can consider a thing in its quintessential state to be the archetype for manifestations of the thing to adhere to. So the point of quintessentiality is the point beyond which there is nothing more fundamental except for total universality itself. Another way of putting it would be to say that to conceive of something in its quintessential mode is to envisage a particular aspect of total universality, or to envisage total universality in a particular mode. Before we begin, we also need to make a clarification in the way of Praxism being an ism. This should not be understood as some type of conditioned ideology or dogma. The ism of Praxism corresponds to something that is much more fundamental than ideology, which will become clear in the following sections. With these initial remarks, we may now proceed into the first part of the video, defining Praxism as a term and outlining the conception itself in isolation. Praxism as a conception is universal and quintessential according to the definitions provided previously. To define something with one set of terms and characteristics is to exclusivize it to that definition, and to limit it from all other terms and characteristics of equal validity by which it may be defined if it were to be examined under different conditions. So if we were to try to define Praxism on the basis of its potential applications, then Praxism itself would be wholly ineffable and would not possess any single all-encompassing definition whatsoever. Therefore, the definition we provide to the term Praxism must be exclusive enough to identify the conception independently and in isolation, but it must also be broad enough to encompass all of its potential applications. What we are speaking of when we reference Praxism is a conception that is in its applicable state. It is universally applicable to all things of any scale, and therefore it is not in its applied state. It is a conception that cannot wholly be realized in its true form, because, as we've said, universality and quintessentiality require a state that is unconditioned, which would indicate that its true quote-unquote form is actually outside the world of form itself, because to have form is to be conditioned. So when we speak of Praxism, rather than referring to something of form, what we are referencing is a sort of pre-established formula by which all things are necessarily prearranged, and a universal conception that can only be partially or adequately identified within other non-universal conceptions. A good starting point is the origin and etymology of the word. We coined the term Praxism out of a combination of the English word praxis and the suffix of ism. Praxis is defined as a process by which a given principle becomes realized, and ism denotes that which is becoming realized through the process. So Praxism, etymologically speaking, is an independent conception concerning a principle itself and the realization of that principle. So the most fundamental definition we can give for Praxism is to say that it is a conception in which a design, the active fulfillment of that design, and the way in which that fulfillment is realized are identified as a single quiddity or as united in singularity by the term Praxism. It can also be used in reference to any of these components considered individually, and it can denote the necessity of these components where they are not present. So, in isolation, and removed from any of its applications, Praxism is a formulaic conception in which a design, the active fulfillment of that design, and the way in which that fulfillment is realized are all united as one idea, identified by the term Praxism. This definition covers all of the necessary prerequisites to identify the conception both as a formulaic and universal notion, and as an applied principle or an identifiable aspect of a given non-universal conception or notion. Praxism is therefore an essential conception which has many potential forms. But once a form has been realized, it is no longer Praxism itself, but a manifestation of Praxism, or an applied and conditioned variant of the wider and more holistic conception of Praxism. And these applications can range from being to things of an immediate sphere, or to an ontological sequence of principles which extends back to a most fundamental source. Everything has a Praxism, because either the given thing being considered is one part of a wider design and has a certain function in a system that is beyond itself, or it is a system itself with a specific internal operation and a design that must be fully adhered to by all of the parts it consists of in order for it to properly function, or both. Important to this conception is the notion of propriety. We define propriety simply as the proper state, or the state achieved when Praxism as a conception is in full effect, or, in other words, when a design is properly fulfilled. With what has been said, we may now move into the next section of the video, which will outline the application of the conception of Praxism to the highest degree. To apply Praxism to the highest possible degree is to apply it to the totality of reality itself. This application is a consideration of reality in its entirety as a singular unit that has a specific operation to it and provides a corresponding formula to which all things about it must adhere. Praxism applied to the totality of reality likewise amounts to the design of reality, the fulfillment of this design, and the way in which this fulfillment is realized. In this application, nothing at all is left unconsidered, by virtue that what we are considering is the very nature and design of reality itself, and that all things partake of this design in some way. To put it another way, we often hear terms associated with philosophic and religious schools depicting the notion of a law with a capital L, which gives order to the universe, as well as the conduct and manifestation which conforms to this law, and which also corresponds to the essence and quiddity of beings. In order to disassociate this idea from any one system, and to depict this notion individually and in isolation, Praxism, applied to the totality of reality, is synonymous with these notions of ontological and universal law and corresponding activity. Therefore, to examine Praxism applied to this degree, we need to examine reality as a whole, and also the universal way in which all things participate in reality as a whole. Before we proceed, it is necessary to establish another term that we use for the sake of comprehension, that being holistic monism. We define holistic monism as a type of universalism that distinguishes a singularity which produces and incorporates a multiplicity. In other words, holistic monism denotes a universality in which a provided singularity is superior, a priori to, and incorporative of a provided multiplicity. This is a design according to which all things derive from the greater unity and have a certain designated participation within it. Holistic monism is also another way of expressing the idea of Praxism, because the design of the universal one is carried out by the multiplicity it produces and incorporates. So Praxism applied to this highest possible degree amounts to a holistic monism which deems that there is one reality and one type of existence from which all other realities and types of existence derive, and upon which they are contingent. According to this idea, existence is provided derivatively by that which is more fundamental to that which is less fundamental. Existence is derived through an ontological sequence of principles that begins with a most universal, most quintessential, and most fundamental member, and concludes in an indefinite number of non-universal and less fundamental beings. In other words, existence is preordained from the top down, through a sequence that originates with that which is most fundamental, which is also the most universal and the most quintessential, also called the monad, and relativizes into a given being. What we have called the monad is given a capital M, and what it denotes is that which is most fundamental. This monad is the ground for all of existence, and if this most fundamental principle were to cease its existence, then all things would also drop out of existence, by virtue that they are created, produced, and incorporated by this most fundamental member. This also suggests that the essence or design of a thing is a priori or logically prior to the existence of the thing itself, or the manifestation of that thing in the temporal domain. Therefore, beings themselves are metaphysically preordained, possessing a specific design to which they must adhere, which is incorporated into the ultimate design provided by the monad itself, or the design of the totality of reality. Therefore, for an individual being, to adhere to its preordained design is for that being to properly participate in the total design of reality, which is only fulfilled if all things within reality adhere to all of their preordained designs. This is necessary to understand for the sake of comprehending Praxism applied to this scale for a number of reasons. Firstly, because this itself is the design of reality in its totality, and nothing less abstract can be said about it without examining individual things themselves, and not a notion which uniformly applies to all things. But secondly, because this establishes the necessity of at least two distinct domains, the first being the domain in which the design itself exists in a pure and undifferentiated state, this being the metaphysical domain, and the second being the domain in which the thing itself is distinct from the design, this being the physical domain. The domain of metaphysics is what we call the quintessential reality, which is another term we have coined. We define the quintessential reality as the domain of total universality in its complete, undifferentiated, and unindividuated state. In other words, the metaphysical state. It is total universality, or all things, conceived of as an a priori essence that is logically necessary as an interior principle to distinguishable beings. The quintessential reality is, in other words, the domain of oneness and singularity, not the same oneness of the monad, but a oneness conceived as a primary and integral unity from which any type of multiplicity whatsoever is derived and further removed. Therefore, the quintessential reality is the domain in which the design of reality, and as a result the design of all things, and reality itself are indistinguishable. In this domain, there is no division whatsoever. There is no distinction between design and thing, or between essence and existence. Design is reality, and reality is the design. In this domain, there is simply pure being, and this type of existence is what we consider to be a participation in the quintessential reality, more on which later. The quintessential reality is the highest reality, and it is therefore the reality on which all other realities are contingent, and from which they are sequentially derivative. All realities owe their existence to the quintessential reality, and they are all incorporated within it in some manner. Because the quintessential reality incorporates all things as an undistinguished total universality, it also incorporates all things as distinguished individual beings, by virtue that this universality logically precedes these beings. This creates a series of sequential iterations which further distinguish the contingent realities to which we may refer as participatory modes of being, and this continues until we reach the mode of manifestation, or the temporal and physical reality. This is the mode of being in which a thing itself is removed from its design. Now, in order to fully illustrate Praxism applied to reality in its entirety, it's also necessary to examine how it applies to the individual being in the grand scheme of this totality. The physical reality is the domain in which the thing itself is removed from its design. This can be equated to a distinction between the essence and substance of a thing. The design represents its essence, and the thing itself is a manifestation of this essence consisting in substance. These are the two fundamental components of a thing of this domain. The essence of a thing corresponds to its metaphysical aspect, which signifies the thing in its conceptualized form. This is what we may consider to be the essential truth of the thing being considered, which is another term we have coined. We define the term essential truth as the a priori conception of a given thing. The essential truth is the highest, most fundamental truth about the thing being considered, and every other truth about the thing is incorporated in some way into the essential truth. Therefore, the essential truth corresponds to the totality of the thing as it is conceptualized, and as it participates as an essence in the quintessential reality. The essential truth acts as a formula for the thing, which is translated and conditioned into the material sphere to bring about the thing itself. The thing owes its existence to its essential truth, regardless of whether or not it actually adheres to it, which is contingent on other aspects. The thing itself, insofar as it is manifest, corresponds to its physical aspect, which is the substantial materialization of the essential aspect. This manifestation possesses a number of constituent parts, all of which represent what we call a substantial truth about the thing. This is a term we have coined for the other component of a thing of this domain. We define the term substantial truth as any one identifiable or observable truth about a given thing. A thing may have many of these, whereas it only has one essential truth. The substantial truths represent the particular aspects of the thing considered individually and on their own scale. They are named as such because they work together to substantiate the thing being considered, and because they correspond to the substance of which the manifestation is actually made. Because the actual thing in this domain is separate from the design, we may have a set of substantial truths which do not properly reflect or align with the essential truth of the thing itself, and this is what we consider to be an improper manifestation. The design is not fulfilled in the being, which means that it is not Praxism. A substantial truth is only proper insofar as it corresponds to the essential truth of the totality, and the totality of the being itself is only proper insofar as all of its substantial truths are proper as well. So we may define Praxism applied to a given thing as the essential truth of the thing, or as the active continuity between an essential truth and all of its corresponding substantial truths. Every substantial truth, however, because it represents part of a whole, also represents an individual being of a lesser scale. This being also possesses an essential truth because it too has an a priori conception. The importance here is that the essential truth of the thing of a lesser scale is incorporated by the essential truth of the thing of a greater scale, and this in turn is incorporated into an essential truth of an even greater scale, and this series of incorporation continues until all things are incorporated under a single essential truth, and this is what we consider to be the quintessential truth of all of reality, which is a term we have coined to denote Praxism as applied to the scale of the totality of reality. In other words, the quintessential truth of reality is the fundamental design of reality, or the necessary and fundamental operation of reality within itself according to its own design. Whether or not certain things adhere to this design is whether or not this highest application of Praxism is being fulfilled in that particular instance. So the conception of Praxism can be applied to reality as a whole as a singular and complete unit, but in so being, it is also necessarily applied to each individual being within reality to indicate its necessary place in the wider design. Now, we mentioned earlier a type of being that indicates what we called a quote-unquote participation in the quintessential reality. And this phrase can be considered the Praxism of any individual being when considering reality in its totality. The reason Praxism is the legitimizing factor for determining the propriety of a given conception is because it signifies this participation in the quintessential reality. The quintessential reality is the holistic domain from which the temporal domain is a sequential departure or derivative. There isn't one set point where metaphysics ends and temporality begins. In reality, the temporal domain is just another thing that possesses an essential truth which is incorporated by a previous and more fundamental essential truth. Therefore, the temporal domain is incorporated by the metaphysical domain simply by virtue of the priority of the two domains and the universality of metaphysics. So certain aspects of metaphysics possess a temporal character to them that connects the two domains in an effective and coherent fashion. This means that all temporal beings owe their existence to this higher reality a priori, and this is the connection between essence and substance and the path through which a temporal being may participate in the quintessential reality. Any being which exhibits an alignment between its substantial truths, its essential truth, and the quintessential truth adheres to its design and participates according to its mode in the quintessential reality. The ontological status of the being is automatically heightened because when all the proper alignments are made and all the correct potentials are actualized, the design and the adherence to the design become one thing within the being. In a sense, the being becomes the design, and the design becomes fully manifest as the being. Now, of course, the manifestation still bears all of the same temporal qualities, which means that the being itself is still subjected to the laws which dictate the temporal domain, but these qualities themselves are now secondary to the primary quality brought about by that participation in the quintessential reality. Before moving on, it is necessary to shortly dwell on the topic of metaphysics and the quintessential reality in order to make a few clarifications. Because metaphysics signifies the universal, it cannot be condensed or refined in any manner according to any particular set of parameters. Attempting to systemize it accordingly would be antithetical to the actual nature of metaphysics, which is something completely unrefined and not systematized. At best, metaphysics can be understood as a design or a formula, much like how we've distinguished Praxism in this sense, but it is a design that is completely abstract and nondescript. However, because all things are derivative of this domain, and because the quintessential reality is universal and the temporal domain is not, beings of the subordinated domain can only interpret and interact with the quintessential reality through conditioned and relative means. Therefore, a certain type of systemization is necessary in order for this access to take place, in certain cases. This, of course, leads to a necessary distinction between the metaphysical ideas that are associated with a given system and the conception of metaphysics as it is independent from any given system whatsoever. The latter consideration is what we call quintessential metaphysics, and this is metaphysics that exists prior to interpretation, refinement, or expression, and this is what Praxism as a conception is concerned with. Quintessential metaphysics can only exist prior to expression, because expression requires temporality, and temporality comes subsequent to metaphysics. Now that's not to say that we can't understand metaphysics, or that there are not valid interpretations or expressions of it. We just have to keep in mind that none of these expressions are able to encompass the totality of the metaphysical domain, and that each expression emphasizes some elements which may be neglected in other expressions. So any system that tries to define metaphysics according to its own parameters is automatically flawed by not being able to incorporate that which is outside of its own parameters and elements of other systems which contrast with its parameters. But again, this doesn't negate the validity of the system so long as the system itself is a proper interpretation and expression. Also, a participation in the quintessential reality does not always necessitate a corresponding interpretatory expression or a metaphysical doctrine. It simply necessitates the aforementioned alignment between a being, its substantial truths, its essential truth, and the quintessential truth. This participation in this type of being is the primary factor when considering applied praxism in general, because it signifies that all functions within all degrees of reality cohere with one another and that, thereby, the entirety of reality is properly operating according to its own design. So praxism is being fulfilled by this type of activity. This type of activity is also what we call archetypal fulfillment, and this is yet another definition we can give to applied praxism. This means that this factor is at the forefront of all operations, practices, and expressions within our temporal reality that could be considered or designated as praxist. Anything which has this orientation towards this type of participation in the quintessential reality can be considered praxist, regardless of whether or not it contrasts with or even contradicts another thing of the same type when examining their own immediate parameters. What this results in is a multitude of equally valid paths from the mundane reality to the quintessential reality, which are achieved through the utilization of some type of expression that allows for this type of participation, and which are validated insofar as they are successful. If they are unsuccessful, then they are not Praxism, as what Praxism implies is a proper characterization and expression of the quintessential reality that allows for a participation within it. The ideas we've outlined in this section are a brief overview of what constitutes the highest and broadest possible application of the conception of Praxism. Namely, we have outlined Praxism as it is applied to the totality of reality, and have provided a brief survey of some of the most important implications associated with this application. I must stress that there is absolutely nothing left out of the assessment made when applying this conception on this scale. Everything about reality and everything within reality are all included and incorporated in some way into this broadest design. It is necessary that we begin with this assessment, however, because any other application of the conception of Praxism is restricted in comparison, and is limited in scope and scale to the domain of its consideration. On top of this, to consider Praxism in any such other application is to envisage the proper fulfillment of a being's individual nature or design, which is ontologically prior to the existence of the being itself, and incorporate it into the total design produced by the monad, or the design of reality itself. By now, we have provided sufficient information enough to identify Praxism in a given context according to these terms. So we will move to the next part, which is the application of Praxism to the humanistic sphere. To apply Praxism to the human principle, or to the humanistic sphere, is to conceive of the fulfillment of the human design according to the highest possible implication, and this is to envisage the human principle in its relationship with reality as a whole, in its unique position in the ontological and hierarchical sequences that determine the various modes of being. In other words, Praxism applied to the humanistic principle is the participation of the human in the quintessential reality, and what this ultimately amounts to is tradition. Not tradition defined as the simple transmission of any routinely performed activity from ancestor to posterity, which is spelled with a lowercase t, but tradition defined as any humanly practice or activity that directly accesses and allows for a participation in the quintessential reality, which is tradition spelled with a capital T. To be truly legitimate according to Praxism, any sort of tradition of the lowercase t sense must adhere to the design set for it by the quintessential idea of tradition spelled with a capital T. This means that there is a potentially infinite number of possible proper lowercase t traditions, as what they truly are is an adaptation of the universal capital T type of tradition into a given set of conditions. These conditions consist of, but are not limited to, things like locality, circumstance, aesthetic, language, ritual, and so on. Each of these traditions, while they might have the same central theme and orient themselves towards the same general purpose, express themselves through a variety of modes and differentiate based on their specific purpose. These traditions also have a narrowing factor about them similar to the one which is found in the derivative metaphysical sequences. The value of these traditions must be understood as their adherence to metaphysical doctrine, and not their expressive formalisms or conclusive statements. This is the dichotomy of the esoteric and exoteric functions of a proper traditional lineage. The esoteric function relates to the quintessential principles which perpetuate and legitimize the tradition itself. The exoteric function is the way in which that specific lineage is expressed. The esoteric principle is at the core of the tradition, and the exoteric function is a manifestation and interpretation of that core through a corresponding set of formalisms. In a sense, the exoteric function is the way in which the esoteric function is accessed and interfaced with. Now, the esoteric aspect only has a single element to it, which is a materialization of the quintessential aspect of reality, and the esoteric function itself is a path from the mundane reality to that higher mode of being. The exoteric aspect has an indefinite number of elements because these are all related to manifestation. These consist of things such as the bylaws of the tradition, the historic events that relate to the tradition, the specific ritual actions associated with the tradition, or maybe even the people allowed to participate in the tradition in the first place. These aspects characterize the tradition because they are the conditioning elements applied to the esoteric principle to make it accessible from the human condition. So all proper traditions have the same esoteric core with the same elements applied to it, but have different outward manifestations to them which differentiate between them. We must also make sure to emphasize the use of the word tradition and not religion, because this idea is not limited to the clerical sphere. Every single vocation, occupation, practice, operation can and should be focused upon formatting the quintessential truth into its own unique sphere, regardless of the religious factor. So Praxism can be found in the proper theologies as much as it can be found in the proper sciences, craft traditions, martial arts, music traditions, mathematical and logical schools of thought, politics and statecraft, anywhere in which an archetypal fulfillment or an understanding of the quintessential reality may be found can have a praxist orientation and be considered as praxism applied to the humanistic sphere in that particular instance. After all, what it signifies is the fulfillment of the human participation in the quintessential reality, and the way in which this is achieved. This is why we as Praxia, or the Praxis Society, place such an emphasis on the perennial or universal idea. We as a group do not accept the exclusivity of the conclusion, but rather the exclusivity of the design from which many proper and valid conclusions can be arrived at. In other words, we accept the exclusivity of the conclusion of propriety. All this being said, we can now move on to the next part, which is identifying praxism in other conceptions. Praxism, of course, has many implications, but it is still relatively simplistic when reduced to a formula with certain criteria. In this section, I will simply list the tenets of praxism according to the various applications and identifiable instances in other conceptions. Of course, these vary depending on instance, and the only universally applicable idea throughout all of these is the conception of a design, the active fulfillment thereof, and the method of fulfillment itself. Any conception that possesses these aspects can be considered a formalized variant of praxism in which some or all of the following tenets may be expressly identified. The first of these is quintessential universality, the union of these two terms to consider the totality of all things. Next is monism, a conception which denotes oneness or singularity, oftentimes in which certain seemingly disconnected subjects are unified by a more fundamental ontological predecessor. Next is holism, a conception that considers the totality of a given body, typically coupled with monism to produce the idea of a monad that incorporates the entire body of things being considered. Next is the identification of an ontological hierarchy based on a priori necessity and relationships of superiority and subordination relative to the degree of universality exhibited by the various principles contained therein. Next is the idea of aseity, or the identification of a mode of being which is self-derived and independently perpetuating, namely the quintessential reality or the domain of the monad. Next is what we have defined as a participation in the quintessential reality, or an orientation towards the quintessential reality. Any conception which establishes this relationship between the being and the higher domain allows for this participation and exhibits this characteristic. This is synonymous with theosis or henosis depending on context. Next is the idea of archetypal fulfillment, or transposition of the archetypal idea into the relative being. Now, when praxism is applied to its total possible scope, that being the quintessential truth of reality itself, including metaphysics and a manifestation thereof, it is also important to understand the metaphysical doctrines in which praxism exists and in which it does not. Praxism's associated metaphysical themes are as follows. First is the idea of quintessential or universalist theology, or theology envisaged in its most universal aspect. Along these lines are the theologies which conclude on a variant of what we have called holistic monism. Next is the idea of panentheism, or a theology which both establishes an ontological distinction between the quintessential reality and the temporal reality, in which the former extends beyond time and space, but also considers the necessary intersection and correspondence of these two realities. Next is the idea of hypostasis, or the idea of a most fundamental state or reality that supports all lesser or contingent realities and from which these latter realities are ontologically removed. Next is a monolatry and henotheism that is subordinated to holistic monism, identifying metaphysical powers but keeping consistent with understanding and orienting towards a most fundamental principle. It is also necessary to examine the characteristics of praxism applied to the humanly principle and identify it within various humanistic or social conceptions, and these are as follows. First is the idea of the human principle itself deriving its being from a greater intellectual principle and combining this derivative with a physical manifestation. Next is the idea of the partition of the spirit into greater and lesser modes, this being evident in the bipartition of regality and mundanity and the quadripartition of the caste system. Next is the idea of initiation, in which the ontological status of the recipient is elevated to the aforementioned greater mode of being. Next is the idea of involution or degradation, when the immaterial spirit is attuned to the material world, this being evident in the doctrine of the ages. Next is the implementation of traditional doctrines, according to the definition of tradition provided previously. Next is the ordering of social conceptions hierarchically to the effect that that which is higher is truly superior and closer to a metaphysical doctrine than that which is subordinated. In the broadest application of the conception, praxism can be considered either as synonymous to or present within a few terms and conceptions as follows. First is the notion of a principle or a law which orders all of reality, including all things within it, otherwise considered as the notion of total universal truth, which we have defined here as the quintessential truth. This can be found, for example, in the Sophia Perennis, or the perennial philosophy, and the Prisca Theologia, or the primordial tradition, in Dharma, in the Vedic sense, in Mat, in the Egyptian sense, in Arta, or Asha, in the Zoroastrian sense, in Tao, in the Taoist sense, and the list goes on. Next is the notion of that same principle which is present within all things, otherwise called the essential truth. Next is the notion of individual conduct or activity which corresponds and conforms to this principle. Of course, there will be terms left out of this consideration simply because to include them all would take too much time. However, I believe there are enough that have been said to identify Praxism among analogous or distinct themes. In all that has been said, I hope that I have provided enough of an outline as to understand Praxism both as an isolated conception and as applied variants of the conception in particular spheres. This conception itself is what we as a group are dedicated to espousing, and this is the position from which we analyze anything on this channel. I would like to thank you for your time, and if you have made it through the video and enjoyed it, consider giving it a like, as it very much helps out the channel. If you would like to see more of this content, consider subscribing and clicking the notification bell to see all of our video publications as they come out. If you would like to read this article in written format, you can find it on our Substack. My name is Vincent. Thank you once again.